Hey everyone, today we're going to go over Standard 7, which deals with World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. So the first topic we're going to talk about is totalitarianism. In totalitarian states, the government holds full power and does not recognize individual rights. So some of the totalitarian states that rise during this time period are going to be the Soviet Union, all right, also known as the USSR, and it's going to be led by dictator Joseph Stalin. Okay. Second, we have Italy. Fascist Italy. Italy's going to be led by Benito Mussolini. Third, we have Nazi Germany. And it will be led by Adolf Hitler. And then lastly, we have Imperial Japan. And that will be led by Hideki Tojo. Okay? So all of these totalitarian states are going to have an element of militarism. Germany and Japan both launched aggressive wars against their neighbors. Britain and France tried to appease Hitler by allowing him to invade neighboring countries, basically giving him what he wanted. We call this appeasement. And it allowed Hitler to gain in strength. World War II began when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. The German army's Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, strategy was effective against French and British forces, and France fell in just over a month. Britain was left to fight against Hitler alone. Germany attacked Britain by air in a 3-month battle known as the Battle of Britain. Most Americans favored a policy of isolationism that would keep the United States out of the European war. Of course, this goes back to George Washington and his policy of isolationism. Since the era of imperialism, we've slowly started to get back to isolationist roots. And part of this were the Neutrality Acts. So these ban the sale of arms to belligerent nations. The word belligerent means nations that are at war. Although Americans wanted to stay out of the war, President Roosevelt, FDR, believed that the British were in need of our help. He wished for America to become the arsenal of democracy. Basically, for us to help supply Britain with the things that they needed to fight these totalitarian states, mainly Nazi Germany. Okay, so as part of this arsenal for democracy, we get several plans between the U.S. and Britain. The first of these is going to be cash and carry. Okay, in 1939. So basically, Britain can buy supplies from the United States. However, they must pay in cash and carry the goods with them on their own ships. And of course, this is to prevent Britain basically forming a lot of debt to the United States, which could potentially pull us into the war because we want to get paid back. And it's also supposed to avoid American ships being targeted by German submarines like they were in World War I, which helped pull us into that war. Okay, number 2, we have the destroyers for bases. Okay, plan. U.S. gives Britain ships in return for naval bases. So the British Empire had naval bases all over the world, and they really needed ships. They've been fighting in the war for a while now, and they needed more ships. The United States wasn't at war. We had ships that weren't being used, so we traded some ships for bases. Thirdly, we have the Lend-Lease Act 1941, Britain can borrow our weapons since we're not using them. So we're lending and leasing out weapons, not directly selling them. Okay, 1940, we get the Selective Service Act. This is the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. So we were not at war yet. However, we implemented the draft to build up our army just in case. The United States placed an oil embargo on Japan for launching aggressive warfare in Manchuria, China, and the Pacific. So basically, we were refusing to sell them oil, protesting their wars in Manchuria, China, and the Pacific. Japan, seeing the embargo as a threat to its ability to maintain a navy, attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The United States declared war on Japan the next day. Okay? Now, that's going to be an issue because of the Axis Pact. All right, after the U.S. declared war on Japan, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. in keeping with the Axis Pact, an alliance between the three nations. So our declaration of war on Japan was then seen as a declaration of war on Germany and Italy because they were all allied in this sort of defensive agreement. Okay, as America geared up for total war, U.S. government policy on the home front during World War II can be summed up in 4 words. Shut up, produce, sacrifice, and hate. And this has to do with the different propaganda that the country was pushing. So shut up. American citizens were told to keep their mouths shut so as not to undermine the war effort. Labor unions pledged not to strike. During wartime, labor was to be fully committed to production. And this is kind of important because we were experiencing the Great Depression before the war, and the war itself is what gets us out of that Great Depression. Because of all the items necessary for fighting the war. Production was key to the war effort. The War Production Board converted peacetime industries to war production. Women were encouraged to work in defense industries while men were away at war. So this is all part of that produce section. Okay, Rosie the Riveter became an icon for female munitions workers. You can see her in the poster there. Very iconic propaganda poster. FDR's Executive Order 8802 prohibited racial discrimination by any company receiving a government defense contract. So that's going to help cut down on discrimination. Immigrants from Mexico provided necessary farm labor. So they're really pulling out all the stops here to try to get as many people in production as possible and produce as many supplies as they could, not only for the U.S. Army, but also for Britain, as well as the Soviet Union, who Hitler would attack and bring into the war. Okay, sacrifice. In addition to prioritizing production, the government placed restrictions on consumers, and they did this through rationing and price controls. So rationing, you're only allowed to buy a certain number of a product depending on your need, the size of your family. Okay, and then price controls, basically the government is setting the price for certain items. They can't go above a certain price. Okay, so this is different from World War I in that here we have mandatory rationing. You don't have a choice with this, okay? Consumers were urged to use surplus income to buy war bonds to help finance the war effort. So war bonds, just like in World War I, we see the use of war bonds to help pay for the war. Okay, lastly, hate. The Japanese, aka the Japs, as they were called at the time, were thoroughly dehumanized in American war propaganda, which led to discrimination against Japanese Americans. Due to paranoia about espionage, Japanese Americans on the West Coast were rounded up and placed in internment camps. Okay, we get a Supreme Court case out of this, Korematsu versus the United States in 1944, where the Supreme Court voted 6-3 to uphold forced internment of American citizens. This will later be deemed unconstitutional, and the government will sort of apologize and pay reparations for the families who went through internment. Racial discrimination in the military persisted, with black soldiers serving in segregated units. This would last until Harry Truman desegregated the military in 1948. All right, moving on to the big three. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So we're talking about the alliance of the Allies here. So first we have the United Kingdom. And they're led by Winston Churchill. Okay. And their government was a democratic capitalist government very similar to ours. The United States, we of course have President Roosevelt, FDR, democratic capitalists, and then also an unlikely ally, but an ally nonetheless, the Soviet Union, or the USSR, led by Joseph Stalin. And it is one of those totalitarian states. Not only that, but they're also a communist state. Okay? However, they all have one thing in common, okay, and that is that Hitler sucks. Okay? So, the European theater. So this is the part of the war that was fought predominantly in Europe. So we're going to go through some of these. So in 1942, we have Operation Torch. All right, that's the British-U.S. invasion of North Africa, where they're expelling Nazis and Italians from North Africa and then moving on to the invasion of Italy in 1943. Okay. Mussolini will be taken out by his own people and hanged in the streets as American and British soldiers are gaining ground in Italy. Okay, so the U.S. and Britain are fighting the Germans on the Western Front. All right. The Battle of Britain versus Germany. This is Germany's attempt to invade Britain. They are trying to take out the Royal Air Force so that they can invade the island. They are unsuccessful in doing that. Okay, 1944, we have D-Day, or the Normandy invasion. This is important because it helps open up that Western Front. Between Operation Torch and really since the Battle of Britain and Operation Torch, the Soviet Union has basically taken the brunt of the Nazi army, the German army in the Eastern Front. So the Normandy invasion opens up the Western Front. U.S. and British troops, as well as Canadian forces and other allies, invade France, okay, on the beaches of Normandy, and start fighting the Germans on the Western Front. Okay, so the Eastern Front is where the Germans are fighting the Soviets. Major Soviet victory on the Eastern Front is Stalingrad, and it turns the German army around, and they're kind of put on the defensive there. Okay, last big offensive by the Germans before the end, Battle of the Bulge. Okay. All right. So competing Allied priorities. The Soviets wanted the U.S. to open up a second front in Western Europe, but the British wanted the U.S. to produce bombers. The U.S. chose to produce bombers to help the British while millions of Soviet troops and civilians lost their lives fighting on the Eastern Front. The 1944 D-Day invasion, better late than never, forced Germany to commit troops to the Eastern, Western, and Italian fronts. In May 1945, German resistance collapsed, ending the European side of the war. Okay? So, Anglo-American invasions, that means British and American invasions of Europe. We have North Africa, Operation Torch, right, 1942, Italy in 1943, and then Normandy, which, remember, is part of France, in 1944. Okay, the second part of the war is the Pacific theater. These are the things that are happening in Asia and the Pacific Islands. So the main strategy of the Pacific theater is going to be island hopping. All right, the island hopping campaign. Goal, strategic islands, airstrips that would facilitate a U.S. invasion of the Japanese mainland. So basically, we're getting closer and closer, taking islands closer and closer to the Japanese mainland so that we can launch our planes and our bombers and fighters from those islands to attack Japan. Okay, so major battles of the Pacific theater. We've got the Battle of Midway, which was sort of the turning point and starts turning things in the favor of the U.S. Okay, 2, we've got Iwo Jima, and then 3, Okinawa. Both of those Pacific islands getting closer to Japan. U.S. soldiers at Iwo Jima and Okinawa suffered heavy casualties, foreshadowing how bloody and costly a land invasion of Japan would be. FDR got Stalin to pledge assistance for a land invasion. Okay, Truman and the bomb. A motto of Harry Truman was, "The buck stops here," basically meaning that, you know, he's the guy responsible for what the military and what the country does overall. So President Harry Truman, he becomes president after the death of FDR. He was FDR's vice president. But President Harry Truman authorized the use of atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay. Truman's number one motivation in ordering this or authorizing this was to save American lives. Okay. He believed that a land invasion of Japan would cost far more lives than would be taken by the atomic bombs. So the result was Japan's unconditional surrender. In addition to saving American lives, as well as arguably Japanese lives, Truman also saw the need to end the war quickly in order to avoid a land invasion of Japan. The Soviets had mobilized on the Pacific Front and had already invaded northern Korea. A land invasion would have required Soviet assistance and would have resulted in the Soviet occupation of Japan. The bomb also displayed the power of American military technology to the Soviets. This set the stage for the Cold War nuclear arms race. So basically, Truman, he wanted to save American lives, he wanted to end the war quickly, and he didn't want the Soviet Union occupying more land than was necessary because, of course, they were communists, and the U.S. did not want those areas that were being occupied to become communist as well. After the war, the U.S. helped to rebuild Japan, which adopted a democratic form of government and became a valuable ally and trading partner during the Cold War, and they remain that today. Okay, so the economic, humanitarian, and diplomatic effects of World War II. War production during World War II finally pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression. In addition to producing more, Americans consumed more, so that helps stimulate the economy as well. They would use money saved during the war to spend on consumer goods after the war, which kept the economy from collapsing again afterwards. Okay, the Holocaust. Nazis sponsored a series of anti-Semitic policies upon taking power. First, we have the Nuremberg Laws. In 1935, these deprived Jews and other groups of their civil liberties. Okay, in 1938, we have Kristallnacht. Okay, or Night of Broken Glass, where Nazis vandalized Jewish shops and synagogues. Although Kristallnacht was widely reported, the United States did little to intervene. After invading Poland, Hitler began to implement his final solution to the Jewish problem, and this is what we know as the Holocaust. It is estimated that over 11 million people died in Nazi death camps. During the war, the Allies took no military action directly aimed at stopping the mass genocide. Once the camps were liberated in 1945, photographs of mass graves haunted the world. These were, of course, crimes against humanity. And at the Nuremberg war crimes trials, 12 Nazis were sentenced to death by hanging for their role in the Holocaust. Okay, moving on to Israel, the Jewish state. Although Woodrow Wilson's 14 points had called for self-determination of peoples, after World War I, Zionist petitions for a Jewish state were ignored at that time. It was not until after the Holocaust that the Allies agreed to the establishment of a Jewish state in the Middle East. So we get the founding of Israel. It was founded in Palestine. The United States and Israel still maintain close ties. Israel remains a key ally of the U.S. and a stable democracy in the turbulent Middle East. Of course, the founding of Israel in Palestine was very controversial for the Arab and Muslim world and still is today. Okay, now we're getting into the beginning of the Cold War. So we have U.S. and its allies who are capitalistic and democratic. We are going to assist allies, Britain and France, to contain communism, to prevent it from spreading. This is, of course, contrary to the Soviet Union and its allies, who are communist and totalitarian, and they want to maintain a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. The Soviets did not allow free elections in the so-called Eastern Bloc countries, and Churchill called this sort of divide between the West and the East an Iron Curtain. Okay, an Iron Curtain separates the Soviet sphere from the Western sphere. Okay, so containment policy. Under Harry Truman, the U.S. government pursued a policy of containment, pledging the United States to resist the spread of communism, similar to Free Soil prior to the Civil War, right? Free Soil was trying to resist the spread of slavery and contain it to the South. The Truman containment policy is trying to do the same thing with communism. So the Truman Doctrine, U.S. helps governments in Greece and Turkey put down communist insurrections. We have the Marshall Plan, aka European Recovery Program, and foreign aid to governments in Western Europe to prevent the election of communist or socialist governments. So economic aid for those countries so that they do not find communism attractive. Okay, occupied Berlin. The Allies agreed to divide Germany and also to divide the capital city of Berlin into 4 zones of occupation. Berlin was in the middle of Soviet-occupied Germany. In 1948, Stalin blocked road and rail access to West Berlin, resulting in the Berlin Airlift, during which British and American pilots supplied West Berlin with food and necessities by air. So they would constantly be flying planes into West Berlin to prevent those people from falling to communism. In 1962, the Soviets erected the Berlin Wall, which became a symbol of communist repression in Europe. Cold War alliances, the goal of these was collective security. So if you attack my ally, it's like an attack on me, and you have to go to war with both of us. If I attack you, then your ally will go to war with me. So we have NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which includes the United States and Western Europe on one side. And then on the other, we have the Warsaw Pact, Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries. And you can see there in the map, the blue are the NATO countries, the red are the Warsaw countries. And that's it for Standard 7. I hope this helped. If you have any questions, just let me know. Thanks.